Susana Mendoza, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We are lucky enough to be with you on a pretty momentous day. News is being made. Everyone knows the whole budget crisis that we've had over the last 3 years. And as we sit here on the morning of May 31st, the Senate passed the budget last night. We're expecting the House will pass it, and as we understand it, Governor Rauner is going to sign it. We don't know if he'll make any mandatory vetoes. But knowing what you know at this point about the budget, first of all, what are your thoughts on what's in it and the political climate that we are in today versus the last 3 years of the Rancor?
Sure. Well, I think what happened yesterday was, frankly, pretty beautiful in the scheme of things, right? Because we saw, for the first time in many, many years, I mean, as far back as I can remember, I don't remember when we saw like widespread bipartisan support for a budget bill. I mean, in the 10 years that I served here, pretty much it always had to come out on a roll call of one party, the Democrats. So seeing complete buy-in from almost every single Republican in the Senate was a beautiful thing to see. And so what we see is a consensus budget, which will help us have some stability and predictability when it comes to our finances. It will allow my office not necessarily to breathe easy as a controller responsible for paying the state's bills, but to be able to breathe. And that is that's something that's kind of been long overdue. We've been in a massive triage mode since the minute I walked into this office, and going through 3 years without a budget, a 736-day crisis, was brutal to our state's finances. And this is a really good sign of what's possible when Democrats and Republicans put politics aside and come together to work on behalf of the people of the state.
I was going to say, if anyone wants to know what it's like to have been in your position the last 2 years, it's probably like trying to run a household when you lost your job.
Yeah.
And you have a little bit of money in the bank account, maybe a little dribbles in from a part-time job here and there, and you're trying to take that little bit of money and keep the household functioning when you really don't have enough to pay everyone that
Sure.
you owe.
I'll take it even one step further. So you're in that situation with sick or dying children, right? This is essentially what was happening in Illinois. I mean, I knew it was going to be a tough job when I ran for it, and even when I won it, but like, I didn't really think about the fact that I would be in a position as the state's chief fiscal officer to have to be making life and death decisions on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis. And those days need to stop. And so I'm very much looking forward to having this predictability and stability with the state's finances that will then allow me to better triage through the state's fiscal crisis. We're still in a fiscal crisis, but it's significantly less than what it was when I first took over as controller.
So if we go back, the last time we had a budget passed was last summer, right after the 4th of July, but that was passed over the veto of Governor Rauner.
Right.
And we had Republicans both in the House and Senate, Senator Dale Ryder in the Senate, and about 11 or so Republicans.
There were 10 who voted to override.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think Bob Pritchard was on a trip to Russia at the time.
Right.
That he would
have been the 11th.
He would have been the 11th. In any event, we did get a budget so that we didn't go into junk bond status.
Yep.
We're just above that. But at the time, and I say this somewhat as a setup so we can contrast then to now, the bill backlog, according to your website, like in September, I believe it was about $16 billion, 16 plus.
16.7 billion was the
And
peak.
I was surprised yesterday because I had said recently in an interview that now it's about 8 billion, but yesterday the ledger was 6.6 billion.
That's right.
So almost $9.5 billion down. So how did we get, in fact, I had a Republican, by the way, say to me, what a great job you did.
That's wonderful, thank you.
How did you get $9.5 billion, I'll use round numbers, of reductions, when in last year's budget we had $6 billion of bonding authority?
That's right. So really smart fiscal management. And I'm very proud of the job that not just myself as controller, but with my staff, who's so incredibly dedicated, that we've done in laying out the roadmap for fiscal stability. So number one, we advocated very strongly against the objections of Governor Rauner to do a bonding deal that would allow us to take $6 billion in bonding authority that the legislature gave us and then refinance $6 billion worth of the state's $16.7 billion bill backlog. Essentially then utilizing some of those dollars to pay down bills that were accruing a 9 to 12% late payment interest penalties, right? So because we don't pay our bills on time after 90 days, they start to accrue late payment interest penalties. Kind of like if a person at home watching this wasn't paying their credit card on time, they get whacked with a late fee. So those fees have now totaled over $1 billion because of the budget impasse, just over those 736 days. So essentially we said, why pay 12% when we can go to the market with this bond deal and cut our interest in half? It turned out to be an even better deal. Thankfully, after 2 months of pressuring the governor and basically shaming him into taking action, he finally relented, did agree to go to the market, and then we were able to get a 3.5 percentage point interest deal on that bond. So
actually, I wanted to make.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember exactly what was the actual amount. Do you remember?
The $6 billion.
Was it 3.5?
We got it at 3.5%. So we went from paying 12% and 9% on many of those bills to 3.5%, and we're essentially saving taxpayers a net $4 to $6 billion over the course of the 12-year program. And so this was a really, really smart fiscal decision on our part. And then not only did we pay down $6 billion of that with the with the bonding deal, we took those $6 billion and earmarked as many of them as possible to pay down bills that would allow us to seek federal matching dollars. So essentially turning that $1 into $2.
So primarily Medicaid payments.
Exactly,
right?
all the Medicaid bills. So for the most part, we ended up turning that $6 billion into closer to $8.5, almost $9 billion. And that brought down the bill backlog. Remember, though, that every day we get more bills coming in. So it's not like a dollar for dollar reduction in the backlog.
Right. It's not a stagnant, just like running a business or a household.
You still have new bills
coming in.
And we don't have the revenues to pay for them. And so the tax increase that was part of that budget deal did nothing to pay down the bill backlog. The way that we paid down the bill backlog was through this smart bonding deal that we did that saved taxpayers billions of dollars in late payment interest penalties and gave us an immediate cash flow to be able to pay down a lot of these bills that had been over 2 years late. So imagine doing business with the state, rendering services, and then not being paid for 2 years. We essentially the state put many businesses out of business.
I was going to say, we can lose sight of, when you talk budget numbers, especially when you're talking billions of dollars, it's easy for your mind to glaze over, but these are real bills.
That's
impacting real lives.
Real people.
I ran into a dentist at a local restaurant, and he heard that I covered state government, and he mentioned that one dentist here in Springfield said he was owed $600,000.
Yep.
And you think, how can anyone operate? Not to mention, we heard, of course, the stories about so many of the universities didn't know how they were going to continue going, and all the disruption that meant, not only for them, but many places are economic engines in their regions, such as Eastern Illinois, Southern Illinois, et cetera. So included in last year's budget was the tax increase from 3.75% on income to 4.95%. Do you know what, one always speculates, especially when you're dealing in billions of dollars, a little variation in the economy will mean hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you know how that has helped our cash flow and how, or as far as our revenues, I should say, how has that changed our revenues and how is our cash flow now for your ability to pay the bills? So
we're still not out of the woods. And what people need to understand about that tax increase is that the tax increase did not give us new revenue to pay down the bill backlog. What the tax increase did was to put a stop to the deficit spending that had just gone on rampantly under the Rauner administration. So to give you an example, when Governor Rauner took office, he had advocated during his campaign to let the tax sunset, and that we were going to be able to manage the state's finances without these additional revenues. So when people were paying 5% income tax, and it went down to 3.75. That would have been okay had the governor then imposed cuts to make up for the difference in the loss of revenue.
Which was about $5 billion.
Exactly. And so instead of doing that, or a combination of dramatic cuts, and maybe you take it from 3.75 to a little bit higher, maybe not 5, but like somewhere in between, you needed a combination of revenues plus cuts. But whatever equation you wanted to do, it needed to add up to cover that $5 billion in lost revenue that happened the minute that tax sunsetted. So instead of doing that, he just continued to spend at the same levels and even higher levels than the Quinn administration did, and it was essentially going unchecked because there was no budget in place.
Right.
And the Comptroller's office, as you may remember, had no visibility as to how the money was being spent and what debts were being accrued. This is why I advocated so staunchly for the Debt Transparency Act, so that as the state's chief fiscal officer, the person responsible for paying the state's bills, I could actually see what bills were being racked up on the taxpayers' credit cards. So there's lots of reasons why we are where we are today. I mean, there's the number one reason that the bill backlog skyrocketed from $5 billion that Governor Rauner inherited, and he is not to blame for the mess that he inherited. It wasn't a picnic. But instead of making things better, paying down a $5 billion existing backlog, he took it in just 2.5 short years from $5.03 billion to $16.7 billion. We have never been in that kind of a bill backlog scenario. It was catastrophic to businesses and to people's health care in particular. And no one should have had to gone through that. It was a man-made, created crisis that was totally avoidable.
So I want to get a handle on where are we now. This is the first time I was just trying to remember that we're going to have back-to-back budgets. And actually the first time, apparently, that Governor Rauner will sign a budget.
Yeah.
But given that we have two, do you have conversations with the bond houses as far as our credit rating? And if so, what kind of feedback are you getting from them relative to, if you've had a chance to talk to anyone about it,
Sure.
which just last night that the Senate passed the budget?
Well, I think the bond rating agencies have been very outspoken as to, I think, their satisfaction in how our office has run the state through this fiscal crisis, managed the state through the fiscal crisis. The decisions that we've been very vocal about respecting debt service payments, no matter how bad the situation got for the state, even when we were on the brink of collapse financially back on July 4th. You know, and I think on June 30th, I did a video making an appeal to the public to please call their legislators and call the governor, to call both parties and demand a budget, because otherwise, come August, we were going to financially collapse as a state. There was no coming back from that. And so the bond market, but even with that, I still stressed publicly, I didn't say it quietly, I stressed it publicly, that no matter what, we were going to respect our debt service payments, because the minute you default on those, we'll never have access to any kind of credit, and it will absolutely guarantee us to go into junk bond territory, which no state has ever gone into.
Has ever done. And if we did go in the junk bond status, which actually is still a possibility, but certainly less so now that we're doing what we're doing. But if we did, you don't get out of junk bond status just because you pass a budget. You're going to be in the doghouse for
a long time.
A long time, which, without going into all the details, would be financially disastrous. We could not have borrowed the $6 billion that you used
and
to pay
definitely not at 3.5%, right?
Not at
so
3.5%, no.
yeah. So we've made wise choices as a controller's office here, and I think the markets have responded accordingly. I think our office has given at least some stability or a semblance of that to the marketplace, calmed some frayed nerves. It's unfortunate that I had to do that with the governor actually working against those type of messages that I was sending. You might recall that he said, don't listen to the markets. On the eve of the budget passing, don't listen to the markets. They don't care about you. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, how do you tell people don't listen to the markets? We're going to go into junk bond territory if you keep talking this way.
Well, it's unusual that a Republican would say don't listen to the markets.
Like it's just kind of, it's ironic, as you say, right? I'm the Democrat, and I'm being totally fiscally responsible here, but it is irony at its finest. But in any event,
part of what I want to do here is which we have been doing, is to lay out. Again, this is a chapter, hopefully that we've closed the door on.
I hope so.
And everyone was, we've had nothing but angst over the last 3 years, basically, on the finances. We've been downgraded something like 6 or 7 times.
8 times just in the last few years.
And so the people who are here are like, well, do we pull the ripcord and jump out of Illinois and go somewhere else? Or is this state turning around, and is it going to regain fiscal sanity? So that's, I want to, this budget is one, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods, as you said, right? It's on the one step on the road back to recovery.
It was a big step, though, on the road back to recovery. This was a methodically thought out budget. It was a true compromise budget. It is really, truly a consensus budget. We haven't seen that in pretty much like forever here in Illinois. So this is not an outlier.
knowing what you know, some people are saying this is a balanced budget. Even Senator Jim Oberweis, who's a very conservative, one of the most conservative Republican senators, said we passed a balanced budget. The Illinois Policy Institute is saying it's about $1.5 billion out of balance because the state is counting money like the sale of the Thompson Center, which they claim every year is revenue and it's never been sold. So I think is a fair criticism in that aspect.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts just of how fiscally sound is this? And I also want to make sure we get to, are there any reforms that you would like to say, here's also what we should be doing that can help the state get turned around?
Sure. Well, number one, in terms of it being a balanced budget, I would say that this is a consensus budget, and it's the closest that we're going to get to a truly balanced budget. So, you know, is it absolutely balanced down to the dime? I can't say that it is, but what I can say is that we are certainly in a much better place with this consensus budget than with any other option that's on the table. So this is absolutely necessary for the stability and predictability of payments from the state. So I think that at this point, we don't want to sacrifice the good for the sake of the perfect. And it's as close to a balanced budget as we've seen in a long, long time. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. To your other point, which was, I'm sorry?
Well, what reforms? I was talking to the mayor of
Yeah.
Springfield the other day. He came in, there was a former mayor, I should say. He said there was $2,000 in the corporate account and they owed $8 million. And he had to make some reforms. And one thing, as an example, I don't know if this would apply to the state, he said some of the unfulfilled jobs we had, we took them off the books because until we did, we still had to be paying workers' comp and health care even though no one was in the job. Because
gotcha.
it was still on the books as a job position. So that saved the city of Springfield something like $3.5 million annually.
Sure.
I don't know, are there similar? Have you had
Well,
the
I
chance
would say
to
that just
look
like
at
from
any?
our office alone, we had a whole agenda package that passed. I mean, 100% so far. So very excited about our success with our legislative agenda. But we introduced one of, if not the largest reform when it comes to transparency in our state's history that was actually instrumental to crafting the budget that we have today that just passed last night out of the Senate and hopefully will pass today out of the House, and that's the Debt Transparency Act. And that allows me as controller to actually have visibility of the state's bills, but most importantly, it allows you as a member of the media and the public to have access to this information. It will, in fact, over time, create peer accountability for governors, regardless of what party they're in, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, to no longer be able to get away with the rampant deficit spending that has occurred under both Democratic and Republican governors' tenures. I mean, this governor has in fact become, by the numbers, it's not my opinion, this is math that tells the story, the largest deficit spending governor in the history of Illinois. But we don't find out about the deficit spending until it's too late to do anything about it. With the Debt Transparency Act reform, we will now be able to, let's say a year from now, when we're talking about a next budget that has yet to be, like the budget has been passed, but not all the expenditures have been done. For example, if the Department of Correction, I'm just going to use a simple number, is given $1 million budget. Obviously, we're talking about much more money than that, but to keep the math simple. If they're given $1 million budget, and 6 months into the budget year, because now we get monthly reporting of all the state's financials, we could look at the Department of Corrections and say, you only have $1 million for the whole year, and you've already spent $800,000, and it's only, you know, midway into the fiscal year. How do you expect to pay another 6 months worth with only $200,000 left, right? Like in the past, we wouldn't know about any of that kind of deficit spending or blowing through your budget early on until it's too late to do anything about it. You can't sound any alarms about it. There's nothing that can be done other than just pay for deficit spending, and that cost comes out of your money as a taxpayer. So this bill itself is going to save potentially hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars over the course of future budgets, because now we'll be able to hold these legislators accountable, most importantly actually the governor, regardless of whatever party, the governor accountable for deficit spending, because the deficit spending is not done by the legislature, contrary to popular belief, right? The only person responsible for incurring contracts that has that authority once a budget is passed is actually the governor. And we've seen just rampant deficit spending. This year alone, last year, $2.5 billion worth of deficit spending that went completely unchecked because nobody could see it. Those days are over.
One of the things, in fact, you remind me when I interviewed your successor, she was saying about how old the computer systems are, that by the time she got the reports, it wasn't actionable. It was 9 months old by the time the numbers. one thing Governor Rauner wanted to do is upgrade and created DO-IT, the Department of Internet Technology or something.
Yeah.
Where are we on that process? Because obviously he was trying to do that in the fiscal crisis we were talking about.
Right.
But I've also had in a separate interview a couple of years ago a woman who is a healthcare fraud expert saying that our computer systems are so old we like leave the front door open for fraud to happen in billings because we can't have one computer system talk to another computer system at that time at least to find out if Dr. Terry's even a doctor or if Susanna's even a citizen of Illinois that's being treated.
Yeah. So, well, obviously, I mean, I have a history and a track record of implementing large-scale technology initiatives that save taxpayer dollars, right? It allows us to do more with less, significantly streamline services, and provide better customer service at lower taxpayer cost. It's ideally what we want. This ERP initiative that the governor has, moved forward with has no accountability, has zero transparency. The public has asked questions. I, as the controller, the person responsible for paying hundreds of millions of dollars to a program that doesn't want to answer simple questions of deadlines and accountability and goals being met or not being met.
So when you ask how much is this going to cost and when are you going to have it done, they don't say.
They don't answer those questions. They don't want to. They just invoice, right? And so, for example, the Highway Authority, they quietly put through an emergency contract for $9 million because their original scope of their entire technology plan, which is part of this ERP, was supposed to cost taxpayers $7 million. So they didn't finish the project on time, which was supposed to cost $7 million, and then quietly put through an emergency contract for a 90-day period to the tune of $9 million. And if I hadn't caught that and made that an issue, like actually talked about that publicly as a fiscal watchdog that I feel I was elected to be, that contract would have gone through. And it's like blank checks are being written for these technology projects that have yet to have shown any type of effectiveness in their implementation. So I really feel like the days of just writing blank checks to people who are not willing to back up their work product are over as long as I'm controlling.
Where does that stand? I'm kind of curious. Did that put the kibosh on that?
It did. It put the kibosh on it, and so far we haven't received any invoices on this or seen a final reworked contract. But I do take pride in being a fiscal watchdog. I think it's important. At the same time, I've been a champion on implementing technology initiatives, and I understand how important they are to streamlining services. But at the same time, you can't just say, I want to advance technology, but have zero accountability with that or transparency. I would be happy to relook at these invoices as long as the people who were asking to answer questions answer those questions and satisfy, my curiosity to know whether or not these invoices are legitimate.
There's so many things we could ask, and we're going to run out of time. So let's just see if we could go. As far as we were talking about cash flow, and we had many, I mentioned the dentists being owed $600,000. Healthcare providers, as you know, we're turning around and saying to state workers, we're not going to do your operation unless you pay $5,000 in cash or something up front. I mean, they were telling people that. We're not out of the woods by a long shot on the overall state, but have we solved that or not on, let's say, the healthcare things? Where are we specifically better off as far as getting paid up and where things are starting to function again?
Well, obviously, we went from a $16.7 billion backlog to what is today about a $6.6 billion backlog. So that means that many people got paid for a whole bunch of bills that they were owed. So I think people are much happier today than they were a year ago. But we're still not totally out of the woods. I'd like to get that bill backlog down to next to nothing, and eventually we'd like to have a surplus, right? That would be a really wonderful thing to be able to say that we have in Illinois, which we've had before.
I just wanted to add a little footnote to that number. So we're at 6.6, but when you're spending about $38 billion, which is going to be the new budget, I'm told, a normal cycle of bills would be about $3 billion. So it's almost like you're current. You're not
exactly.
We're not
far
going to go down to zero. I mean,
exactly.
But I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want people to understand that you're not. No one's going to get it down to zero because everyone who operates their house has current bills.
Of course, you always have a bill. For example, it might be 30 days or 60 days. It's a normal course of doing business.
Right.
But we don't want to have bills that are 91 days old, because at that point they start to incur late payment interest penalties. And ideally, if we can get within a 30 to 45 day window, that would just be like the most pristine business, right?
We've heard about the colleges and universities. They were
Sure.
thinking about, or have we gotten enough to them that we're holding back the water, so to speak?
They get a 2% increase in this year's budget, but it's still, I would say, not enough. We should be investing more in our higher education system, but it's certainly a better place than they have been in the last few
Well, and
years.
that's going forward. What about the bills that we owed them? Have
Oh, yeah, they're up to date. I mean, we have prioritized funding to education since the minute I walked
then
in.
they have working.
Yeah.
They have some working
Of course, they
capital
have
in
some
it.
cash flow. And I have advised everybody to be very conservative, even with the money that we've given them for services that they already rendered, because I wasn't sure if we were going to have a budget. But it looks very promising today, and I think we're going to be in good shape.
One of the issues that the people of Illinois are going to be considering in this gubernatorial election is a progressive income tax that Mr. Pritzker wants. I believe the governor is against that. Do you have any thoughts on that? And has anyone come to you and say, hey, what should the numbers be on that score? And if I actually, can I interrupt myself? I meant to ask, when you were sending the invoices, I was impressed that you're looking, but how do you physically do that when you have $38 billion or so coming in invoices? I mean, that would seem like a monumental task. How does the comptroller's office look to see, are these legitimate invoices?
So we don't the way it works is if you contract with the state, let's say you contract with the Department of Aging, your contract is with them. So you would invoice Department of Aging, and then they would verify the validity of that invoice.
And then
once
submit
they sign off on the invoice, then they submit the voucher to us, at which point, if we have the money to pay for it, we would execute a payment. So we're not really doing that. Where we've seen these issues is, for example, on red flags, the contract that I just mentioned to you earlier. I was not about to pay for that. I don't believe that not finishing a project on time because you're a bad project manager warrants an emergency of more than 100% of the original cost of the project, right? To me, that's just bad project management. It doesn't get rewarded with more money.
Right.
And questions have to be answered before I'm going to just willy-nilly write a check for something that I have no idea what I'm even paying for and seems sketchy on its face. So I still feel like we're still a last line of defense for taxpayers, and being a fiscal watchdog is an important role that the Comptroller's office should play as part of being a check and balance on what's happening in the executive branch. So I take that role very seriously. And being transparent about our finances is critically important. We have a bill that we wish the governor would have signed before this budget actually passed, which he's delaying his signature on, and that's the Truth in Hiring bill. And that would require governors of any party to be truthful in their budgets as to how many employees they truly have. Because right now, Governor Rauner, for example, in this year's budget, claimed to have 44 employees at a cost of $4.9 million, when in fact he has 102 employees at the cost of $10.4 million. So he's hiding 58 employees in other state agencies, and then once the budgets are passed, he pays for his own employees out of other state agency budgets, and that's not right. It's an issue of separation of powers being violated, but it also takes needed resources away from entities like public safety, human services. You know, money for autistic children should go to autistic children. It shouldn't be spent for like a web designer on the governor's payroll, right? So these are things that need to stop. Every governor, besides Governor Rauner, has done this deceptive practice. It's a way
because
of
it
hiding.
makes them look like
Of
a fiscal,
course.
like I've cut down my budget when they
Exactly.
really haven't.
No, they're hiding their budget in other areas and actually negatively impacting those other state agency budgets. And so moving forward, this will be the law of the land because we were able to pass that in both the House and the Senate. And with or without the governor's support, this is going to be the new law. It will likely apply, because the governor has refused to sign the bill, he doesn't want it to apply to him, to the next governor, and that's fine too, because frankly, I don't care if it's a Democrat or a Republican. You should be honest with the public as to how you're spending their dollars.
Rather than the progressive tax, maybe I'll leave that for others.
Oh, no, let me answer that.
Okay.
I am totally in favor of a progressive tax because I feel it's a tax reduction to the vast majority of people in Illinois. So rather than call it a progressive income tax, I'd call it a progressive tax cut. It just depends how much your tax cut is going to be. And so J.B. Pritzker is very much in favor of that. Every Democratic gubernatorial candidate was in favor of a progressive income tax. Again, I see it as more of a tax cut for the people who are not in the highest echelon of the pay scale, and I could see why Governor Rauner would be so virulently opposed to it. because he stands to lose financially. But, you know, the mom who's trying to get her kid through school is going to stand to gain with that type of tax structure.
One thing that I was having an interesting conversation the other evening, as you well know, you go out to functions and it's
Sure.
a good time to talk with people off camera and kind of get other people's insights. And I was talking to a couple of legislators, and Ralph Martiri, who people hopefully watch Illinois Channel will be familiar, but they were making the same point that Ralph has made for a number of years, and that basically one of the primary problems with Illinois is that we are saddled with a 1940s taxing system
right.
in a 21st century economy. You're saying yes, and that was, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And I've had people say, in fact, Republican Mike Fortner, who's a PhD in physics, not a dumb guy, ran numbers, and he was saying if we had a 5% across-the-board sales tax on services as well as what we currently tax, that you could be bringing the property taxes down by about 25%, according to him. Whether, not to get stuck into his math necessarily, but have you looked at this, or you've been a member of the House as well? What in general are your thoughts about the need to rewrite our tax system?
Well, number one, I have a lot of respect, as I think most people in this chamber do, for Ralph Martiri. So I think when he speaks, people listen. I do think, though, that when you're talking about taxes, you also have to be talking about, and we should be, and I don't think we do enough of this, talking about you know, not just adding more taxes and new spending without being willing to make some cuts in the process and to find areas in which you can streamline services and save some money. So, like, taxpayers, number one, want to know what is the tax rate that I'm going to be paying, because that's an issue of predictability, which leads to stability. I think the concept of people necessarily leaving the state and only saying that it's because it's of taxes is disingenuous. I think people, when they don't even know what their tax rate is going to be,
well, I think a lot of it's property tax
disarming.
is a crushing
That's right.
tax, because that's not based on your ability to pay, whereas the income tax
Right,
is.
and because we've had such an over-reliance on property taxes to fund education, and hopefully with the new education reform bill, that will do a good job of trying to at least not make local municipalities have to run to the property tax well to help pay for schools. But now you're hearing Governor Rauner talk about shifting, you know, pension obligations or whatever from the teachers to local municipalities, which will be a guaranteed property tax increase. So
right.
You can't say on one end, I'm against property tax increases, and then actually further policies that directly will increase property taxes.
And
so,
I don't want to get into a political tit for tat before we close out, though, but I'm looking to think, what kind of reforms? You know, we've just come out, and I think everyone's wiping their brow. We almost went over the cliff.
Yeah.
And maybe there's a sobriety as part of what of this bipartisanship that we saw last night in the Senate, and I expect that we're going to see in the House. Maybe that's like the drunk who almost drove over a cliff. We almost went over a cliff, and there's now a more sober attitude and responsible, and hopefully we're going to dampen the political poison that's been so impacting the state. And I just wonder if you know, you can't know everything. You're doing your job, but if you had some thoughts on.
I think it's to hold the line on new spending. I mean, really, we need to get our house in order, and we still have $6.6 billion of the bill backlog. That's still a lot of money that we owe people for services already rendered. And so any new revenues really should be looked at in the context of how is this going to help us get our house in total perfect fiscal stability, before we start adding new programs and things of that nature. Of course, like, could you advocate for more things that are going to help people? We'd all love to be able to do that, but if you can't afford to do them at that time, we might have to wait a year or two before we do that. First things first, get our house fiscal order done and do it well. And that might take a few years. And then we can start looking at, do we have a rainy day fund? You know, like, do we have a surplus? Like, if we do, how would we look to spend that? We still have the $129 billion in pension, unfunded pension liabilities that we can't ignore.
And that's what I was going to ask. Can we ever get our house in order without having some real reform of pensions?
Well, the reform has to be one that would be constitutional, and so far we haven't succeeded at that. Or we might actually just bite the bullet and say, we have to pay those pensions. and new revenues should be fully dedicated in large context to paying down pension debt. Because if we can at least exhibit a plan to eventually pay down those bills, we don't need to pay $129 billion right away. But the markets would certainly respond favorably, I believe, to at least a plan on how we're going to get there. We're going to dedicate X amount of new revenues every year to pay down pensions and have a plan. That's going to take that amortization rate, which is like sky high right now, and dramatically bring it down, right? So as long as there's a plan in place where we don't just keep ignoring this, not even talk about it, and continue to kick the can down the road every year when it comes to pension, I think the best way to actually move forward on this is to actually start paying down, putting some money into those pension funds.
Susana Mendoza, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.